off against Marjorie Taylor Greene in a heated hearing over whether millions of dollars in public health funding are a lifeline or a waste. Greene tries to humiliate Crockett by calling her the GAVEL clown, mocking her for defending poor rural communities. But just minutes later, Crockett flips the entire room with undeniable evidence from Greene's own district budget. The chamber falls silent. Greene is left speechless, and the insult turns into a national scandal. What did Crockett say that turned a smear into the most powerful moment Congress had witnessed all year? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing room inside the U.S. Capitol was cold and tense, lit by pale white lights that gave everything a harsh, clinical edge. Rows of dark leather chairs faced a long desk lined with microphones. Flags hung still behind it. But the silence wasn't respectful. It was thick, watchful. The topic on the agenda was federal funding for public health, but everyone present knew this wasn't going to be a routine debate. Something was building. A quiet pressure settled over the room, as if the floor itself were holding its breath. Jasmine Crockett sat near the end of the table, composed and silent. A former prosecutor from Texas, now a congresswoman, she was no stranger to high-stakes rooms like this. She represented the communities most overlooked, rural towns with no clinics, families with no insurance, mothers who waited too long for ambulances that never came. Today, she didn't dress for cameras. She came to speak for lives that didn't get airtime. Calm, deliberate, and listening closely, she was ready. But she knew what she was walking into. Across from her, Marjorie Taylor Greene leaned back in her chair, confident and fully aware of the cameras. The Georgia congresswoman thrived on confrontation. Known for inflammatory speeches and sharp theatrics, she wasn't here to weigh policy. She was here to land a blow. Her papers weren't filled with statistics. They were stacked with lines designed to sting. She had a move prepared, not a counterpoint, a calculated attack. The room knew it. Staffers moved with quiet caution. Aides exchanged brief looks. Everyone could feel the shift. Greene hadn't come to argue budget. She came to make a moment, and Jasmine Crockett was the target. The moment her microphone light turned red, Marjorie Taylor Greene didn't pause to ask questions. She delivered a verdict. "This budget," she began, her voice steady and unhurried, "is not a lifeline. It's a leak, a fiscal black hole swallowing accountability whole." She leaned into the microphone with a confidence that came not from expertise, but from performance. The first words out of her mouth weren't about lives or communities. They were about loss, her version of it, financial, not human. She wasn't here to ask whether people were getting the care they needed. She was here to say they didn't deserve it. Behind her, a video began to play. On the screen, an open-air parking lot in a forgotten part of rural America. Folding chairs lined up along the curb. Volunteers in scrubs handing out medicine from under a blue pop-up tent. An older woman gripping her walker waited in the heat. A boy, maybe 10, sat in his mother's lap while she whispered to a nurse. It was quiet, humble, desperate. The kind of scene that might move someone to ask, how did it come to this? But not Greene. She turned toward the footage with a smirk, gestured casually and said, "What you're seeing isn't medicine. It's welfare wrapped in a stethoscope." Her voice didn't rise. She didn't need to yell. Every word was meant to land hard and sound final. "This is what we're funding?" she asked the room, turning slightly in her chair so her voice projected in all directions. "Pop-up pharmacies, feel-good giveaways, and drive-through diagnosis booths?" She gave a slight chuckle, as if the image itself were absurd. "They call it public health. I call it performative pity." Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't look away, but she stopped writing. Across the table, Greene was still going. "Let's talk numbers," she said, though she never cited any. Instead, the screen flipped through a handful of headlines stripped of their context. Small towns receiving emergency COVID funds. Counties rebuilding after their only clinic shut down. Millions allocated to wellness outreach in places I can't even find on a map, she said with mock offense. "You want me to fund more masks and Band-Aids in ghost towns?" She said it without hesitation, without irony, as if the only failure worth caring about was fiscal, not human. "My district pays taxes, my people work, and they're sick of footing the bill for programs that reward failure and dysfunction. Her tone was measured, but her words were cutting. Not just to the programs, to the people in them. This isn't oversight, she concluded. It's a guilt offering. And frankly, we're being hustled in the name of compassion. And just like that, the hearing no longer felt like a policy discussion. It felt like a courtroom, one where the sick had already been convicted of being inconvenient. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch, but her stillness now carried weight. She knew that the people Greene was talking about weren't statistics. They were neighbors, veterans, farmers, children. She knew because she had been in rooms like the one in the video. She had sat on plastic chairs beside her own mother, waiting hours to be seen by a nurse who was working a double shift. She knew the ache of being ignored, not by accident, but by design. And now she was watching it happen again, this time on national television. But just as the silence in the room threatened to settle, Greene twisted the knife, not into policy, but straight into the person sitting across from her. Then, with a calculated pause and a smirk that didn't reach her eyes, Marjorie Taylor Greene turned her gaze directly toward Jasmine Crockett. The room felt it before she said a word, an anticipatory hush, as if everyone knew the next line wasn't for the budget record, but for headlines. Greene didn't blink. She didn't look away. Her tone shifted, less formal, more mocking, like a schoolyard taunt dressed up in congressional diction. "I just hope," she said slowly, almost sweetly, "that today the gavel clown won't take the stage for another one of her community pain performances." The words hit with a deliberate cruelty, stripped of pretense. It wasn't a jab at policy. It was personal, public, and humiliating, designed to frame Jasmine not as a lawmaker, but as a dramatic sideshow. Greene's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the chamber sharper than any shout. A few aides shifted awkwardly. One member of the majority party looked down at his notes, pretending not to hear. But Jasmine heard it. The whole country did. The insult was clear, but the message beneath it was even more vicious. That Jasmine's voice, rooted in lived experience, in decades of systemic neglect, wasn't real leadership, but political theater. That her stories, her facts, her grief were props. That her gavel, the one she'd used to maintain order in chaotic hearings, wasn't a symbol of authority. It was a toy. And the nickname, the Gavel Clown, wasn't a casual throwaway. It was branding, a smear meant to follow her beyond this room, into every future headline and soundbite. Jasmine didn't flinch, but her knuckles had gone white against the edge of the desk. Her silence wasn't submission. It was pressure. Tight, building, steady. She didn't look at Greene. She looked straight ahead, because the only thing more dangerous than being mocked was choosing the exact moment not to respond. But Greene wasn't finished. One insult wasn't enough. She wanted to leave a mark, one that wouldn't fade when the cameras cut. She leaned into the mic again, calmer now, as if the damage she was doing wasn't just intentional, it was routine. "She's got a great swing with that little hammer of hers," Greene said with a smirk. "I'll give her that. The gavel clown can sure make noise." She let the words settle, made sure everyone heard them clearly. Her voice was smooth, unshaken, but the message behind it was sharp. Jasmine Crockett didn't belong here. Not as a leader, not as a lawmaker, and certainly not as an equal. "Honestly," Greene continued, "every time I hear that gavel smack, I don't even need to check the news. I already know. The gavel clown is putting on another show." She didn't laugh, but her smile widened. She emphasized the word clown like it was gospel, like it belonged in the congressional record next to Crockett's name. The room remained silent, not because the moment wasn't shocking, but because no one knew how to respond. Some staffers looked down. A few blinked awkwardly, pretending to skim papers, but the cruelty was too loud to ignore. Greene had stopped talking about policy. She was attacking identity, legitimacy, respect. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett sat unmoving, her head tilted slightly downward, eyes fixed on the page in front of her. Her pen moved, slow, steady strokes, but not for appearance. She was writing something, quietly, carefully. Her face gave away nothing, but her posture was tight, controlled. The kind of control that only comes from years of being underestimated, years of being spoken about instead of to. She didn't speak, not yet, because she knew that anything said too early would be taken from her, twisted, used to prove Greene's point. So she waited. But the audience watching, millions across the country, were not waiting. Screens lit up, phones buzzed, comments poured in, not about Greene's policies or positions, but about the venom in her tone. She called her, "What? Why is no one stopping this? That's not debate. That's bullying." What was meant to humiliate Jasmine had begun to humiliate the chamber itself. And still, Crockett did not lift her eyes. Because sometimes silence is not surrender. Sometimes it's the tension right before impact. As Greene's final words hung in the air like smoke after a shot fired, Jasmine didn't flinch, because in that moment, she wasn't in the chamber anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere that had shaped everything. She was 12 again, standing barefoot on the uneven boards of a front porch deep in rural Texas, where the stars were bright but help was always distant. Her mother had collapsed just steps from the doorway. No warning, no cry, only the dull sound of her body hitting the wooden floor. Jasmine had frozen, heart pounding so hard she thought it might drown out her voice as she screamed. No one answered. Not the neighbors, who lived too far. Not the emergency dispatcher, because there was no signal, no working landline. The nearest clinic was nearly 50 miles away, a number Jasmine didn't fully understand back then, but she knew it meant too far. She had no car, no adult, no way to bring help, just a flashlight running low and legs that weren't meant to carry a child across open fields in the dark. She ran anyway. Branches tore at her arms. Mud swallowed her sneakers. She remembers the sound of her breathing, ragged, desperate, louder than the crickets. She found someone hours later, but by the time help came, the danger had passed, not because it wasn't real, but because time had simply moved on. Her mother survived, barely, but something inside Jasmine changed permanently that night. She had learned before she even knew how to write her full name in cursive, that in certain parts of this country, survival was not a right. It was a gamble. And if you were poor, rural, or black, the odds were always against you. That night didn't become a sad story she occasionally told. It became law carved into her bones. She had walked through fire to reach a world where she could one day hold the gavel, not just cry for help. And now, here in this chamber, someone who had never run for a parent's life, who had never known that kind of fear, was calling her a clown for remembering, for refusing to forget, for daring to speak for people still living that nightmare. Greene's voice may have filled the room, but it was Jasmine's silence that held the weight of generations. So when her mic finally lit red, Jasmine didn't posture or retaliate. She simply breathed, met Greene's gaze, and asked the kind of question that didn't need volume to shatter a room. "Mrs. Greene," she said softly, but without hesitation, "have you ever sat in the back of an ambulance for 40 minutes in the middle of the night, holding your mother's hand, wondering if she'd make it to the clinic, because it's the only one left and it's almost an hour away?" The words didn't come out angry. They came out real, plain, heavy. Her tone didn't waver, but the stillness in the room changed instantly. Eyes shifted. Staffers froze mid-note. The kind of silence that follows an unexpected truth settled like dust. "Have you ever looked into your mother's eyes," she continued, "and realized she was slipping? And there was no ER, no doctor, not even a nurse within reach?" She didn't need a slideshow. She didn't need a headline. This was the headline. "That's not drama, Congresswoman. That's Tuesday night for families in towns you wouldn't bother to drive through." Jasmine kept her voice level, but her words cut clean and deep. "You talk about budgets like they're numbers. I talk about them like they're people. Because they are." Her hands stayed still. She didn't raise them, didn't point. "When you say public health funding is a waste, what you're really saying is, some lives just don't matter enough to save." She looked around the room, not for applause, but to be certain everyone heard her. And those are the words that never show up in the final transcript, but they're the ones people remember, especially the ones still waiting for help that never comes. She paused, not for effect, but because there was nothing more to add. And for the first time that morning, no one dared speak over her. But Jasmine wasn't speaking from memory anymore. She was speaking from the present, from the names and places that rarely made headlines, where budgets didn't just shrink, they vanished. In Newton County, Missouri, Jasmine said, her voice calm but resolute, the last hospital closed its doors 14 months ago. No notice, no replacement, just locked gates and an empty building where life once had a fighting chance. She paused not for effect, but because she knew the weight of what came next. Now all they have is a community clinic, open 2 days a week, Tuesday and Thursday, no overnight care, no ambulances based locally, no trauma center within 30 miles. Her tone didn't rise. She didn't need to shout. The truth, when told plainly, didn't require volume. It required courage. So if your child spikes a fever on Friday night, or your father collapses during church on Sunday, you don't call a doctor. You call a friend. Or you wait, and you pray. No one interrupted, not because they agreed, but because they suddenly remembered how numbers become names, how line items turn into funerals. This isn't some distant tragedy, she continued. This is America, right now. These are citizens, taxpayers, veterans, children, and you want to tell them they're not worth more than 2 days a week of basic care? She didn't glare. She didn't smirk. She just let the question hang, exactly where it belonged. And in that moment, the quiet in the hearing room said more than any sound ever could. Even those who had chuckled earlier had gone still, because Jasmine Crockett had made it impossible to look away. But as Jasmine's words drew the room into the lives of people most lawmakers never met, Greene began to shift, not with logic, but with resistance, the kind that rises when truth hits too close. She snapped. It was subtle at first, a sharp inhale, her fingers drumming faster against the desk. Then her composure cracked. We're not here to hear emotional stories, Greene burst out, voice louder than necessary, carrying frustration that had nowhere else to go. Her chair scraped as she leaned forward, face flushed with irritation. This isn't some open mic night for grief, she added, waving a dismissive hand in Jasmine's direction. We are here to review federal spending, not hold hands and cry about clinics in Missouri. The words landed harshly, not just because of their volume, but because of their intent. She wasn't arguing anymore. She was trying to erase what had been said, to silence it before it took root. But it was too late. The room had changed. Staffers no longer shuffled. Members no longer glanced at their phones. Everyone was watching because everyone understood what had just happened. Jasmine hadn't broken decorum. She had broken through. And Greene's outburst wasn't strength. It was fear disguised as defiance. Fear that facts with a human face couldn't be ignored. That budget lines, when read aloud as lived experiences, became impossible to justify cutting. And Jasmine? She didn't blink. She didn't look at Greene. She simply waited, like someone who knew the storm had already passed her and was now circling the one who started it. Mrs. Greene, Jasmine said, her voice quiet but unwavering, you call me the GAVEL clown because I speak truths that don't fit into your slogans. She didn't glance at her notes. She didn't need to. You mock the gavel like it's a prop, but I've held it through hearings that nearly tore this chamber apart because someone had to. Her words were steady, each one measured, like footsteps crossing a minefield. You call me a clown because it's easier than facing the weight of what I'm saying. Because in Texas, people are dying. Not metaphorically, not someday, now. She paused, locking eyes with Greene. They die in pickup trucks doubling as ambulances. They die in waiting rooms that were never meant to handle emergencies. They die in towns with churches and corner stores, but no doctors. And every time I speak about it, you laugh. Her tone didn't rise, but something inside the room dropped, as if the air itself understood the shift. I don't find it funny, she continued, more softly now. Not the gavel, not the stories, not the silence that follows when people like you decide they're not worth the cost. She sat straighter, not in defiance, but in resolve. So yes, I've heard the name, the GAVEL clown. And today I'm saying it out loud, for the first and last time. Because when I hold that gavel, I'm not performing. I'm protecting voices this chamber has long chosen to ignore. It wasn't a comeback. It was a statement of purpose. And in that moment, the insult Greene had flung so easily now hung heavier. No longer a joke, but a judgment on the one who said it. Jasmine had taken the insults, the dismissals, the silence. But now she turned the conversation toward the numbers and exposed exactly what they revealed about whose lives this Congress valued and whose it didn't. She leaned forward, voice low but unshakable, and asked, "You signed off on $12 billion to build a wall across hundreds of miles of sand and scrubland, but you call $800 million for rural health clinics a waste?" Her words landed hard but not hastily. Each one carried the weight of someone who'd read the fine print while watching real people suffer from its consequences. You're willing to pour billions into steel and sensors to keep people out, but when it comes to keeping Americans alive in their own towns, suddenly there's no room in the budget? Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried a deeper challenge. Explain to the country why protecting land matters more than protecting lives. She paused only long enough to let the hypocrisy settle into the air like a slow leak. "Tell me," she continued, "what's the logic in guarding borders no one's crossing while letting citizens in Newton County or East Texas die because they can't reach a doctor in time?" Her hands stayed flat on the desk, her body still, but the tension in her voice was unmistakable. "You say it's about national security. I say national security begins with knowing your grandmother can survive a heart attack without driving 50 miles. Her eyes scanned the room, not in search of validation, but to make sure everyone was listening. "You fund barriers. I fund breath. And one of those things actually saves lives." For a long moment, no one moved. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just asked a question, she had redefined the terms of the debate. What Jasmine said next didn't come from outrage, but from preparation. Because unlike Greene, she hadn't come to grandstand. She had come with receipts. She opened the slim blue folder that had been resting quietly beside her notes, no theatrics, just precision, and held up a single-page document edged in yellow highlighter. "This," she said, her voice clear but calm, "is an internal appropriations memo from your own district's Health Services Board, dated 11 months ago." She looked directly at Greene but spoke to the room. "It proposed a mobile health clinic in Floyd County, your district, serving 5,000 residents currently living more than 30 miles from the nearest urgent care center." Her words were steady, almost clinical, until the next line cut through like a scalpel. "You vetoed it, Congresswoman, line by line, marked it down as non-essential due to, your words, budget constraints." She laid the paper flat on the table, her hands never trembling. No follow-up, no alternatives, no second look. For a moment, Greene said nothing. The cameras caught her blinking, then staring, but her voice, always quick to fire back, stayed still. Jasmine didn't look away. She let the silence build naturally, like gravity asserting itself. Then she spoke again, quieter, but even more direct. "So let me ask you this," she said, each word crisp and cutting. "Does a person's life only matter if it's dying behind a wall?" She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. The question wasn't designed to provoke. It was designed to expose. It didn't just hang in the air. It changed the temperature of the room. And in that moment, every person watching, on the panel, in the gallery across the country, understood exactly what had just happened. This wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. The question had landed with surgical precision, and for the first time since she entered the room, Marjorie Taylor Greene didn't have a single word to give back. Only the sound of her own composure unraveling. The room didn't move. Not a paper shuffled, not a chair creaked. On national television, in full view of a live broadcast in a gallery of silent witnesses, the woman who had owned the microphone now sat in absolute silence. Marjorie Taylor Greene's hands, once animated and expressive, now sat tensely folded, except for her right index finger, which tapped the lacquered wood in sharp, restless intervals. One beat, then two, then faster. She wasn't reading notes. She wasn't checking the document Jasmine had placed before her. She was staring blankly ahead, blinking too often, her expression hardening by the second. The camera, unforgiving, close, relentless, zoomed in. Her jaw was clenched, her lips pressed together. That tapping finger became the only sign of movement, the only signal that something inside her equilibrium had broken. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something more fragile, exposure. And then, with the weight of the room tilting her way, Jasmine Crockett spoke again. No louder than before, but far more dangerous. Her voice carried no triumph, no satisfaction, just control, just truth. "Let me ask you one more thing, Mrs. Greene," she said, not cruelly, not cruel at all, just plainly, as if the logic spoke for itself. "If your mother collapsed in Kansas, and the only way she could get help was through a public broadcasting station sending out a statewide emergency alert, would you still call that virtual policy theater?" There was no condescension in her voice. There was no anger, but there was edge. The kind of edge that doesn't need sharpness to cut. "Would you dismiss it," she continued, "because it didn't come wrapped in razor wire or start with a Homeland Security badge?" Her eyes never left Greene's. "Or would it become real to you suddenly, only because it touched your bloodline?" The words hung there. No theatrics, no posturing, just a question too human to deflect and too specific to spin. Greene didn't lift her head. She didn't object. She didn't even try to pivot. Instead, she looked down, slowly, deliberately, as if somehow the floor could provide an escape the moment couldn't. She gripped the edge of her papers, but didn't turn them. Her mouth opened briefly, but nothing came out. The rhythm of her finger against the desk had stopped. Even her body knew. The camera was still watching. And that was the moment. The shift. The rupture. In a room known for shouting, interrupting, and sound bites spun into cable newsreels, silence had become the most powerful form of testimony. It wasn't that Jasmine had won the argument. This wasn't a contest. It was that she had turned the one insult meant to erase her into a mirror and held it up for the country to see. The gavel clown hadn't just defended herself. She hadn't just answered back. She had left her opponent without language. It wasn't victory through dominance. It was victory through dignity. That rare, impossible silence in Washington, when the words stop because the truth has spoken so clearly, so precisely, that even opposition knows to sit down. That's what filled the chamber now. And though Jasmine Crockett didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't even break eye contact, the message was unmistakable. The gavel may have once been a prop in Greene's narrative, but in this moment, it belonged to the woman who had never once needed to raise her voice to make the whole room listen. The silence that followed Jasmine's final question wasn't just absence of sound. It was the moment a room full of power realized it had just witnessed something undeniable. She didn't flinch. She didn't gloat. Jasmine Crockett simply let the silence breathe. Let it stretch to the corners of the chamber where smirks had turned into stillness. Her hands rested gently on the edge of the table, her posture upright, not proud, not defiant, but steady. She had not raised her voice. She had not delivered a monologue meant for sound bites. And yet every person in that hearing room knew what had just happened. The woman they called a clown had just made the room hold its breath. Across the aisle, something subtle but unmistakable happened. A Republican congressman, quiet, usually reserved, rarely quoted in the press, shifted forward. He had listened through the entire hearing without speaking, his brow furrowed as if studying a puzzle no one else noticed. But now, as Jasmine's words settled like dust across the oak-paneled floor, he looked up. No theatrics, no commentary, just a single slow nod. It was small, private, but in that chamber, surrounded by posturing and deflection, it landed like a declaration. Not agreement on policy, something deeper, respect. He didn't need to say anything. The gesture said it all. It acknowledged the truth Jasmine had put on the record, that some lives are written off because they exist in places without polling weight, without private insurance, without voices loud enough to be heard from Capitol Hill. It wasn't a partisan moment, it was a human one. And that was when the atmosphere in the room changed. The derision, the whispered chuckles, the side glances that had filled the space just 20 minutes earlier had vanished. No one laughed now. No one leaned in to mock her tone. Even Greene, still seated and staring down at her closed binder, had not spoken since. Her tapping fingers had stilled. Her mouth had stayed shut. The smirk that had launched the gavel clown into the hearing record was gone. Jasmine slowly closed her folder with a single soft click of the clasp. She straightened her spine and took one final look around the room. Not as a warning, not as a challenge, but as confirmation. She had said what needed to be said. There was nothing to add. The facts had spoken. The hypocrisy had been laid bare. The lives she carried with her, the mothers, the sick, the forgotten towns, had been brought into that room and could no longer be ignored. She leaned slightly into the microphone and adjusted it back to its resting position. No grand finish, no applause line. She didn't need one. What she had delivered wasn't performance. It was consequence. Then she stood, not with force, but with finality. A quiet kind of gravity followed her as she moved from the witness table back to her seat on the panel. Her heels clicked softly against the tile, each step echoing louder than the jeers that had started the morning. In that moment, the chamber didn't just see a congresswoman. It saw a reckoning wrapped in calm. A woman who had taken every insult thrown at her, not just in that hearing, but across a lifetime, and responded not with fire, but with precision. Every sentence had been a scalpel, every fact a mirror, and now there was no one left in the room willing to pretend she hadn't just shifted the balance of power. As she took her seat, her hands returned to rest lightly atop her lap. Her gavel, so often mocked as a theatrical device, a prop, a symbol used against her, now sat untouched before her. But it no longer looked like something ornamental. It looked exactly as it should, like authority, like responsibility, like justice in a chamber that often forgets what it sounds like when spoken without permission. No one called her the gavel clown now. No one even whispered the name, because names carry weight, and she had just changed what hers meant. Reporters seated in the back of the room stopped typing mid-sentence, realizing they were watching something far more serious than a procedural fight over federal funding. They were watching a line being redrawn, not between left and right, between decency and denial, between spectacle and substance. Even Greene, for all her notoriety and media savvy, sat hollowed in that moment. Her role as provocateur had failed. The punchline had boomeranged, and the woman she tried to humiliate had returned her fire with truth so sharp it left no room for comeback. Not now. Maybe not ever. Staffers on both sides of the aisle looked to one another, some in surprise, others in quiet admiration. What they'd just seen was rare in a building built on scripted outrage and pre-rehearsed outrage. They had seen someone take a nickname designed to diminish her and turn it into a symbol of defiant grace. Because what was the gavel now? Not a stage prop, not a mockery, not a punchline. It was the weight of communities unserved, the voice of families uninsured, the authority of a woman who had earned her seat not by screaming, but by surviving. And now the gavel rested beside her, not as defense, but as proof. The insult had failed. The performance had failed. But Jasmine Crockett had not. And though no headlines had yet been written and no vote had yet been cast, everyone in that room already knew how history would record the moment. The day the clown made the chamber listen. What happened inside the hearing chamber that day didn't stay confined to Capitol Hill. For by the time Jasmine Crockett returned to her office, the fire she had lit was already spreading across the nation, platform by platform, voice by voice. The clip hit Twitter first. 39 seconds long, unedited, raw. Jasmine's voice was steady, her words simple, but they detonated with precision. The American people don't need virtual borders. They need real clinics. The post was shared 50,000 times in under 2 hours. Someone clipped the follow-up too, where she turned toward Greene and said, not with rage but with steel, "Clown? I'm the only one in this room slamming a gavel in defense of life." That one hit harder. The words were real, unpolished, soaked in the weight of what she lived and what others had denied. Within minutes, those lines left the chamber and became something else entirely. A rallying cry, a mirror, a reckoning. Social media didn't just repost it, they branded it. Hashtags emerged from nowhere and burned into visibility. Not a clown, gavel of justice, She spoke, we heard. By noon, TikTok had stitched her gavel strike into music. Boom. They called her a clown. Boom. She called for the truth. The rhythm wasn't just catchy, it was haunting. Clips of rural emergency rooms, shuttered clinics, and news reports of mothers giving birth in parking lots were edited into the beats, layered behind Jasmine's face, her calm defiance, her final words. I don't find it funny. One user wrote in the caption, "This isn't a politician. This is a woman who saw the system fail and decided to outlive it." Instagram flooded next. A still image of Jasmine holding the gavel, eyes forward, spine unbroken, with a quote beneath it in bold white font. "They gave me a name to make me small. I turned it into something they can't carry." The post hit 1 million likes in hours. She hadn't posted any of it herself. Her team hadn't run press. They didn't need to. America did it for her. From nursing students in Arizona to emergency room techs in Appalachia, people who had lived through the collapse of care systems recognized something in her voice. They recognized themselves. They didn't hear a political takedown. They heard someone finally call out what they'd been screaming into the void, in that survival in this country too often depends on your zip code, your race, and whether Congress can see your county from their office window. Then came the testimonials. A Vietnam vet from rural Montana posted a selfie video holding a cardboard sign. "I haven't had a checkup since 2013. I'm not a number. I'm not a burden. I'm what she was talking about." A mother of 3 in South Texas uploaded a TikTok with tears in her eyes. "We buried my father last year because the clinic was closed. I never thought anyone in Congress would say what she said. She said it." A high school senior from Georgia tweeted, "My uncle died in a car while we waited for help that didn't come. I've been waiting for someone to tell the truth. Jasmine Crockett did." They flooded the platforms, not just with sadness, but with solidarity. And the numbers followed. News outlets scrambled to catch up. Headlines broke across cable and digital within hours. NBC, "Gavel of Justice, Representative Crockett's viral moment exposes hidden health crisis." CNN, "From insult to impact, how the gavel clown became a movement overnight." Even conservative outlets, usually quick to spin or dismiss, struggled to frame what had unfolded. Fox Nation ran a segment titled "Jasmine Crockett, Bold or Belligerent?" But in the comment section, viewers were already choosing sides, and not the ones producers expected. And through it all, Jasmine remained silent. She didn't tweet. She didn't issue a statement. She didn't capitalize on the moment, because it had never been about moments. It had been about people. Her silence wasn't absence. It was presence. The kind that says, "You saw what you needed to see. Now what will you do about it?" But others spoke for her. Graphic designers created posters overnight, a gavel made of light slamming down through layers of concrete marked bureaucracy, neglect, disdain. Underneath, they called her a clown. She reminded them what justice sounds like. Marches in rural counties adopted her quote on banners. Protesters outside shuttered urgent care centers chanted it through megaphones. "No more virtual borders. We want real clinics." Journalists dug deeper. They found the funding reports Jasmine had referenced, the vetoes, the hearings, the forgotten counties. They ran exposés under headlines like, "Left Behind, the real cost of rural healthcare cuts, 12 billion in border steel, 0 beds in backcountry Texas." And still, Jasmine didn't speak, because she didn't need to. By the end of the week, the gavel clown wasn't an insult. It was an emblem, a reversal, a reminder that when you call someone small, you better hope they don't know how to make truth echo louder than shame. The gavel had struck once. America was still listening. As the hearing faded from the headlines and entered the bloodstream of the country, it was no longer just a viral moment. It was a reckoning that refused to leave, especially for the one who had set it off. Marjorie Taylor Greene, once the loudest voice in every room, had gone quiet, not just in sound, but in presence. Her calendar, once overflowing with media appearances and quick-hit interviews, began to thin. Press briefings were rescheduled. Local reporters stopped getting callbacks. Invitations to speak at fundraisers went unanswered. In place of confrontation, there was avoidance. And in place of spin, there was silence. The political machine around her, the one built on outrage and headlines, sputtered under the weight of one simple question that kept following her. Why did you call a woman fighting for healthcare a clown? She couldn't outrun it. Not in the corridors, not in the coffee lines, not in the pages of the Washington Post, where an op-ed asked bluntly, when did we decide that courage was something to mock? Not on the floor, where members from both parties now nodded more readily toward Jasmine Crockett, and certainly not online, where even her supporters found themselves at odds with the optics. A confident congresswoman collapsing into silence, and the woman she tried to humiliate rising calmly from the ashes. Cable news ran split screens. Greene storming through old hearings, interrupting, mocking, accusing, juxtaposed with Crockett sitting still, holding the gavel like a blade, slicing through the moment with words as sharp as any weapon. She thought it would be a soundbite, one anchor said. It became a legacy. And in the spaces where legacies are written, in inboxes, in mailrooms, in digital servers strained under the weight of raw public response, Jasmine Crockett became something else. Not just a name, not just a face, a symbol. The letters didn't trickle in. They surged. Aides cleared entire afternoons just to sort the overflow. Some were hand-delivered by interns from neighboring offices. Others came folded inside envelopes with floral borders or receipts used as makeshift stationery. Rural postmarks appeared next to names from cities Jasmine had never visited. The handwriting varied, some precise, some trembling, but the message echoed with unshakable clarity. Thank you. From farmers who'd buried loved ones without doctors. From teachers who'd driven students 2 towns over for emergency dental care. From elderly couples living off oxygen tanks they could no longer afford. From nurses who'd given their careers to systems that gave them nothing back. And from one woman who simply wrote, "You didn't just speak for us. You stood there while someone tried to shrink you, and you didn't move." Each letter, each line, added weight to Jasmine's desk, but also to her shoulders. This wasn't applause. It was need. The country wasn't cheering her. It was begging her. Don't stop. In one padded envelope came a crayon drawing from a child in Mississippi, a figure drawn behind a desk holding a gavel. The words written in block letters above, "She's not a clown, she's a protector." A letter from a black doctor in Georgia read, "I've spent 20 years being the only one in the room who sees what's missing and gets called angry for naming it. I've never seen anyone do what you just did in front of a national audience and walk out stronger than they walked in. You didn't raise your voice. You raised all of ours." From a community organizer in rural Ohio, "Our county clinic closes next month. No one cared until you picked up that gavel and made it impossible to look away." The flood wasn't political, it was personal, and that's why it couldn't be spun. A Republican staffer, caught off camera in a Capitol hallway, muttered to a colleague, "We've spent years talking over people like her." She didn't talk back. She made us listen. That's why it hurts. And still, Jasmine said nothing. No interviews, no press tours. She let the moment speak for itself. Let the silence she'd built in that hearing chamber do the work. She knew what Greene didn't, that not all power comes from volume. Some of it comes from restraint, from knowing that when the fire is burning behind your eyes, you don't have to throw it. You just have to open the door and let others feel the heat. But in private, she read every word. Late at night, long after votes were cast and lights dimmed, she sat in her office, sometimes alone, sometimes with one aide beside her, quietly opening letter after letter. One in particular she folded and unfolded more than once, creased at the corners, the ink smudged slightly from a trembling hand. From a retired paramedic in Kansas. It read, "I've watched people die in back seats in living rooms, and no one ever saw them. You saw them, and you said their names without needing to say their names. That's not politics. That's justice. That's mercy. That's the thing we've been waiting for. Thank you for not letting the insult stick, and thank you for showing the rest of us how to carry truth without screaming it." She kept that one in her bag, and still the press chased Greene. "Why didn't you apologize? Do you regret calling her a clown? Do you think a wall is worth more than a clinic?" She refused to answer, because to answer was to admit it had landed. And in the void left by her silence, Jasmine Crockett's voice carried further. And so the weight shifted. The next time Jasmine walked into a hearing room, the air felt different. Not louder, just stiller, more alert. Staffers nodded. Members sat up straighter. Cameras moved earlier. She didn't need to say a word, and yet every eye was on her. She took her seat, unfolded her notes, and gently placed the gavel beside them. Not like a shield, not like a sword, but like something older and heavier. The truth that had waited too long to be heard. Because the truth was this: they called her the gavel clown. But when the room went quiet, it was her hand everyone listened for. And when the hammer fell again, it didn't sound like laughter. It sounded like justice. And while Washington moved on to the next controversy, and social media searched for the next fire to feed, somewhere far from the cameras, beyond the reach of spin and headlines, something much quieter, much deeper was settling in. On the edge of a quiet plain in western Nebraska, where the wind moved more freely than people, and the sky stretched wider than most politicians' concern, a man named Walter Branson sat alone in his kitchen, listening to the radio. He was 83, his hearing had faded slightly, but his memory had not. He could still recite names of neighbors who died waiting for care, could still recall the night his wife collapsed on their back porch in 1996, and the ambulance took 52 minutes to arrive. He'd watched her die holding her hand. They were just one county too far from help. That was 29 years ago. No one came to ask about it. No one mentioned her name in a hearing. No one ever had. But now, through the grainy signal of his battered radio, he was hearing something that stopped him mid-step. He had meant only to refill his coffee. Instead, he stood frozen at the edge of the table, one hand on the chair, the other still clutching the mug, steam curling in the air. It was her voice, the voice from the hearing. The rebroadcast had just begun, and the house fell still. Walter sat down slowly, creaking as the chair took his weight. The mug was placed on the table, untouched. The only sound was the soft murmur of the radio and the wind gently brushing against the window panes. The hearing played out in full, unedited. Jasmine Crockett's words were not chopped into headlines. They came as they were spoken, deliberate, steady, unflinching. He heard Greene's voice first, sharp, condescending, tossing out the words, "the gavel clown," like they meant nothing. He winced. Not because he was surprised, but because he'd heard that tone before. In town halls where farmers were told they'd need to drive just another hour for care. In calls with bureaucrats who apologized for budget cuts but not for funerals. In news segments where suits talked over the pain of people who never made it on screen. But then he heard Jasmine respond, and he didn't move. "Clown? I'm the only one in this room slamming a gavel in defense of life." The radio signal wavered for a second, but the words cut through. Then came the line. "The American people don't need virtual borders. They need real clinics." Walter slowly leaned back in his chair. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, something clicked, not just in his head, but in his chest. It wasn't just that she was right. It was that she had said it in a place that wasn't made for people like him. She had walked into a room built to mock, and she had made it listen. He remembered standing at his wife's funeral and thinking, no one in Washington knows we even exist. Now, someone did. And so, in the soft hush of his home, he finally whispered, "They called her the gavel clown. But I saw something else. That was a real gavel, from a real heart." He paused, looked out the window at the fields they used to walk together, then leaned forward and turned the volume up. Not for himself, but because something inside him wanted the world to hear it louder. There are names built to belittle, labels shaped to humiliate, words chosen not because they're true, but because they're easy. Sometimes those names stick. Sometimes they follow you. Sometimes they define the way the world sees you. But every now and then, someone picks up that name and turns it into a weapon. They called her a clown because she didn't shout like they did, because she didn't entertain the way they wanted, because she spoke about rural hospitals, empty parking lots, and mothers dying in silence. They called her a clown because the truth sounded too raw, too heavy, too close. But then she raised her gavel once, and she didn't perform. She didn't plead. She struck it, not in anger, but in defense of life. And the room fell silent, and the nation listened. Not because she shouted them down, but because she stood up, because she didn't let the insult stick. She didn't throw it back. She absorbed it, then turned it into something they couldn't carry. She was called the gavel clown, and then she struck once, and the echo still hasn't stopped. But long after the headlines moved on and the hearing room emptied, what remained was not the insult nor the sound of the gavel. It was the lesson, heavy and human, that settled into the heart of a nation trying to remember what justice sounds like. They called her the gavel clown, a phrase not thrown, but calculated, designed to strip power from dignity. And in the beginning, that's what it seemed to do. It was sharp. It was loud. It was replayed 1,000 times. But what they didn't expect was that beneath the label, there stood a woman who had already endured worse. They didn't know she had seen real pain, watched her mother gasp for breath on a back porch while help sat 50 miles away. They didn't know she carried the weight of entire communities forgotten by budgets, erased by maps, and dismissed by politicians too busy calculating optics. They didn't know the strength it takes to speak plainly in rooms built to talk over you. And they certainly didn't expect her silence to cut deeper than their noise. What they learned and what we saw was this. When a person grounded in truth picks up the very weapon designed to shame them, they don't just survive the attack. They turn it into a symbol no one can ever throw again. And that's where the lesson began. Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak. She revealed something that had been hiding in plain sight. How easily we forget the human faces behind policy. In a political ecosystem obsessed with performance, she dared to anchor every number, every line item, every dollar to a real life. She reminded a chamber and a country that when we argue over budgets, we are not arguing over ideas. We are arguing over oxygen tanks, over insulin, over ambulances that arrive too late, and clinics that never opened. She exposed what too many try to avoid, that indifference isn't passive, it's active harm, and that the decision not to fund care, not to build clinics, not to reach out, is a decision to let people die quietly. But her greatest lesson wasn't just in what she said, it was in how she said it. She didn't yell, she didn't pound the table, she didn't match insult with insult. In a world that trains women, especially Black women, to raise their voices just to be heard, she did something radical. She remained calm. And in doing so, she made silence her sword. She made restraint a form of protest. When they hurled the name clown, expecting her to break, she looked back with the full weight of history behind her, and she made that room hold its breath. That was not strategy. That was survival, practiced and perfected over decades. Because when you grow up having to fight just to be seen, you learn that the loudest weapon isn't volume, it's control. Another lesson revealed itself in how the country responded. The people who reached out to her, through letters, messages, video tributes, weren't elites. They weren't pundits. They were nurses who'd lost patients on their watch because there weren't enough beds. They were paramedics who drove all night through rural counties, knowing the ER might already be closed. They were exhausted doctors who saw Medicaid patients sent home too early and treated like they didn't belong. And they weren't thanking Jasmine because she spoke perfectly. They were thanking her because she spoke honestly. What they recognized in her wasn't polish, it was truth. A truth they had never seen spoken into that chamber without apology. One letter put it best. You didn't make it about you. You made it about us. And in doing so, you became someone we can trust. And that trust, the kind built from lived experience, not talking points, is the foundation of every lasting movement. It's the soil from which justice grows. And Jasmine planted that seed not with a slogan, but with a sentence. The people don't need virtual borders. They need real clinics. 10 words, that's all. But they traveled faster than any wall ever built. The lesson for America was clear. Compassion must not be seen as weakness. It is strength under pressure. To call someone a clown for defending the most vulnerable is not just cruel. It is a mirror held to a culture that has come to fear emotion more than injustice. Jasmine Crockett stood in that mirror and shattered it. And in doing so, she taught us all that emotional intelligence is not a liability in leadership. It is the soul of it. Because numbers can be manipulated, speeches can be rewritten. But the memory of a mother dying in your arms because the nearest clinic was 47 miles away, that truth cannot be spun. It can only be carried. And Jasmine carried it into the heart of a government that had forgotten how heavy it really was. But perhaps the most profound lesson was this. Justice does not begin with power. It begins with listening. It begins when we choose to hear the person we've been conditioned to ignore. When we look at the face behind the policy. When we stop dismissing voices simply because they speak with urgency, or with history, or with grief. When we admit that empathy is not a detour from logic, but the very map by which policy must be guided. That's what Jasmine Crockett forced into the room. Not by demanding it, by deserving it. She didn't walk away with a win on paper. There was no immediate law passed, no sweeping reform announced. But the system she stepped into that morning is not the same system she walked out of. Because now when someone says the gavel clown, they no longer hear a joke. They hear an origin story. They hear the sound of a woman who was told to sit down and stood taller, of a district dismissed as unimportant and brought into the light, of a nation that almost forgot who it was and for a moment remembered. And that is the human lesson, that resilience is not noise, that courage is not cruelty, that power is not posture, and that sometimes all it takes to move a nation is for one woman, armed only with lived truth and a gavel of wood, to strike once and speak for those who were never allowed to speak for themselves. But a moment, no matter how powerful, is only as lasting as what we do with it. And now the gavel that silenced a room demands something greater than applause. It demands action. If we were moved by Jasmine Crockett's voice, then we must now ask ourselves what we're willing to do for the voices that still can't reach a microphone. Because the injustice she exposed didn't begin or end in that hearing room. It lives on in shuttered rural clinics, in underfunded hospitals, in the quiet despair of families watching loved ones slip away for no other reason than geography and poverty. It lives in towns where mothers time contractions against the hope that traffic lights stay green all the way to the next county. It lives in classrooms where students carry inhalers like lifelines because the school nurse only comes twice a week. This isn't a crisis of politics, it's a crisis of priorities. And every day we fail to act, we reinforce the lie that some lives matter less because they cost more to save. But we are not powerless. Not yet. Because we've seen what one gavel in the right hands can do. So this is where we draw the line. We must demand more from those who write the budgets. Call your representatives. Ask them where they stood when clinics closed in your state. Ask them if they've ever spent the night in an ER hallway just to keep a parent breathing. Ask them how many billions they're willing to spend on fences while the health of their own people rusts behind them. And if they can't answer, replace them. Because silence is not neutrality. Silence is complicity. And every vote they cast tells us exactly how much they think your life is worth. The gavel Jasmine held wasn't a symbol of ceremony. It was a challenge. A call to every citizen to turn empathy into legislation and witness into will. But the work doesn't stop at Capitol Hill. We must act in our communities, support local clinics, volunteer, fund mobile health initiatives, advocate for Medicaid expansion in states that still refuse to provide it. Raise our voices when rural hospitals are threatened with closure, and stop treating healthcare like charity. It is not a gift, it is a right. Just as roads and bridges connect our cities, healthcare connects our humanity. And when it fails, we all feel the collapse. You don't need a seat. Inside room 2141 of the U.S. Capitol, Jasmine Crockett and Daniel Cameron clash in a live, high-stakes hearing over a haunting question. Did he bury justice to protect the men who killed Breonna Taylor? Cameron tries to deflect with legal jargon and polished denial. But just minutes later, Jasmine drops a sealed email, a whistleblower letter, and a smoking gun timeline that no one can unsee. Cameron is forced back under federal investigation, and the system that once protected him starts to unravel on live TV. Now the nation's asking, what did Jasmine expose that left even his allies speechless? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Outside the Rayburn building, protest banners fluttered in the wind like flags at half-mast. The steps were packed with survivors, organizers, and quietly enraged citizens holding signs that read, "Say her name, and silence is not justice." But inside room 2141, the lights were colder, harsher. This wasn't a protest. It was a courtroom with congressional teeth. The placard above the chair read, "House Judiciary Subcommittee Hearing, Reform after Breonna Taylor." And presiding over it, Jasmine Crockett, seated at the center dais in a charcoal blazer with no jewelry, no distractions. Just a sharpened gaze and a stack of sealed files in front of her, like legal landmines. Her posture was still, but her presence crackled with voltage. This wasn't about party lines. It was about the line of trust America watched disappear the night Breonna Taylor died in her sleep. At precisely 9:01 a.m., the back doors opened. The cameras spun. Daniel Cameron, former Attorney General of Kentucky, stepped into the chamber to a storm of camera flashes. His navy blue suit was crisp, the lapel pin intact, but the weight of recent defeat hung like a second coat. He had just lost the gubernatorial race in his home state, undone not by policy failures, but by the lingering, festering shadow of Breonna Taylor's name and his role in bearing the truth. The hearing room, filled to capacity with lawmakers, staffers, and quiet fury, felt like a courtroom without walls. On the hallway monitor outside, someone had pinned a freshly printed headline from the Washington Post, enlarged and underlined in red Sharpie, "Cameron's Fall from Power, the Cost of Choosing Silence." He took his seat at the witness table, fingers curling once, twice against the wood. He didn't look up at the photo displayed behind the dais. A framed portrait of Breonna Taylor, overlaid with the words, "131 days without charges, a lifetime without justice." And then came the detail no PR team could spin. A public statement from a former grand juror in Cameron's own case, now entered into the record. A single sentence echoed in the room as Jasmine read it aloud. "We were never even told we could consider homicide charges. That decision was made before we ever sat down." The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was political gravity. A system had closed its eyes. And now, for the first time, its architect was sitting under oath, across from a woman who refused to blink. He leaned into the microphone with practiced calm, his shoulders squared, his voice steady, almost too steady. "I know what's been said about me," he began, eyes locked forward, avoiding the photo of Breonna Taylor projected behind him like it might burn. "But the role of an attorney general is not to deliver vengeance. It is to follow the law." His words were slow, deliberate, each syllable weighed down with legalism, stripped of empathy. "And in this case," he continued, "there simply was not enough evidence to bring a homicide charge under Kentucky statute. That is not a political decision. That is a prosecutorial boundary." He paused just long enough for the discomfort to settle. Then came the line that turned stomachs. "Justice cannot be dictated by grief. It is not a reaction to public outrage." A rustle ran through the room. Jasmine didn't blink, but the muscle in her jaw tightened. A woman in the back sobbed, barely, but it was loud in the silence. Cameron pressed on, now leaning into the framing of restraint as virtue. "If we allow emotions to shape indictments, we abandon the law. And I won't do that, not for headlines, not for hashtags." He spoke as if his voice alone could will away the weight of what wasn't done. But around him, every sentence felt less like an explanation, and more like a defense built on technicalities instead of truth. And somewhere in the middle of that chamber, Breonna Taylor's name hung heavier than any law he'd just cited. As the last syllable of his denial faded into silence, Daniel Cameron reached for what many officials do when truth tightens its grip. He reached for numbers, hoping they'd speak louder than the names he wouldn't. He opened a folder with deliberate calm, slid a single page forward, and raised it just high enough for the cameras to catch. "This data," he began, "comes from the National Prosecutors Council and several peer-reviewed judicial audits. In over 60% of grand jury cases where public pressure plays a role, the outcomes are challenged, often reversed." His voice was steady, perhaps too steady, coated in the authority of bureaucracy, but stripped of any human register. That is why I chose caution over chaos, he continued, because when we allow grief to dictate the law, we lose not just clarity, but justice itself. He looked directly at the panel, but not at the gallery behind them, not at the faces that had come to witness what the law so often refused to see. A mother clutched her purse, her eyes fixed not on the paper in his hand, but on the void he represented. A retired nurse in the third row muttered under her breath, "We're not numbers." And she was right. The room remained still, not out of respect, but out of the quiet disbelief that follows the familiar. Because they had heard it before. When Trayvon Martin was labeled a threat, when Eric Garner was called non-compliant, when Breonna Taylor became a footnote to procedure. Cameron wasn't offering new information. He was offering a polished version of a very old excuse. To the public, to the families in that room, he did not sound like a man invoking the law. He sounded like a man invoking distance. Distance from the body, the gunshots, the bedroom floor soaked in blood, the unanswered 911 call. And that, more than the statistic itself, was the betrayal. Not that the system failed, but that the man entrusted to fix it had learned how to defend its failure with a straight face. The numbers had been laid down. The legal citations, the cold rationale, the polished deflection. But the air in room 2141 had shifted, because somewhere between the silence and the statistics, the truth had gone missing. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She raised the volume of what no one else had dared to play. With deliberate calm, she tapped the audio button embedded in her panel. The overhead monitors dimmed slightly, and a soft crackle of static signaled the moment was no longer under anyone's control. Not even Daniel Cameron's. Then the voice came. "We were never presented with any option to consider homicide. We were only instructed to review wanton endangerment. Distorted to protect the identity of the speaker, but real. The voice of a member of the grand jury that Cameron once claimed had made their decision freely and independently. The words weren't theatrical, they were plain, dry, unemotional, and that's what made them land like gunfire." Jaws tightened across the dais. A woman in the gallery, Breonna Taylor's aunt, brought her hand to her mouth. One of the younger staffers behind the panel dropped his notepad and didn't even bother to pick it up. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't explain. She let the weight of the betrayal sit in the bones of every person in that room. The recording ended with a click. Then slowly she reached for a second document, an envelope bearing the seal of the Kentucky Bar Association's Ethics Committee. She opened it with both hands, unfolded the contents like evidence being submitted in a trial. Her tone remained steady, judicial, devastating. This letter was submitted by the Ethics Committee just 6 months after the Breonna Taylor case was closed at the state level. It includes formal concerns not from activists or journalists, but from senior members of Kentucky's own legal profession, stating that Attorney General Cameron exercised, quote, undue prosecutorial discretion, that he withheld from the grand jury critical charging options, violating ethical conduct and undermining the core function of the jury process. She paused, not for effect, but because there was nothing left to read. The words were simple. The implication was enormous. She turned, slowly, surgically, and locked eyes with Daniel Cameron. There was no tension in her shoulders, no emotion in her face. She was past that. This wasn't passion anymore. It was precision. "Mr. Cameron," she began, "you stood before the nation and told them you followed the law. You told grieving families that there wasn't enough evidence to go further, that the system had run its course." She held the document up between them, almost gently, a final nail in the box he had built for justice. "But you didn't let the system run its course. You rerouted it. You narrowed the path until only one outcome was possible. And then you called that process." He didn't blink. "You silenced a jury not because they lacked evidence, but because you feared what they might decide if they were given the full truth." The room was still. Even the clicking of cameras had stopped. "When you conceal the most serious charge, homicide, from a grand jury," she said, voice low but clear, "you are not exercising caution. You are not preserving the law. You are staging a conclusion, one written before the evidence was heard. A woman in the second row covered her mouth with both hands. Another stood, unaware she had done so. Crockett continued, never once raising her tone. You didn't fail to seek justice. You succeeded in avoiding it. You didn't defend the legal system. You choreographed it to protect power. She leaned in just slightly, not to intimidate, but to ensure every syllable was captured on record. You didn't just withhold justice from Breonna Taylor. You withheld the right of a jury to even consider if she deserved it. And then Jasmine Crockett stepped back from the mic, leaving only the paper in her hand, and a silence so loud it felt like thunder beneath glass. The silence after Jasmine's final words didn't simply linger. It grew roots, spreading through the chamber, like truth finally finding oxygen. And in that moment, Daniel Cameron did not refute it with facts. He reacted with something far more revealing. Anger. He shifted in his chair, the polished composure cracking just beneath the surface. The corner of his mouth twitched, half grimace, half restraint slipping. Then, without warning, his voice rang out, sharper, louder, no longer measured. I don't need to be lectured by someone who doesn't even live in Kentucky. The words hit the air with an edge that couldn't be unsaid. He stood now, hands flat against the witness table, his posture defensive, not in legal strategy, but in pride wounded. His tone swelled, no longer aiming for logic, but for territory. You come in here from Texas, wave some paper, play to the cameras, and think that gives you the right to question how we enforce justice in our state? He turned toward the committee, briefly gesturing as if to enlist their support, but no one moved. All eyes remained fixed on him, a man unraveling not because he had been falsely accused, but because he had run out of places to hide. I was elected to serve the people of Kentucky, he continued, voice straining now. I did what I believed was right under the law. I wasn't put in office to score points on social media. I wasn't put there to bend to mob emotion. He stopped, breathing heavily, his gaze returning to Jasmine Crockett. You act like you understand this better than me, but you weren't in those rooms. You weren't on those streets. You weren't the one carrying the weight. His eyes were burning with something between resentment and desperation, fighting not against the facts, but against the mirror she had just held up. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink. She let the moment breathe, let him fill it with every word he thought would shield him, until it became obvious that the more he spoke, the more alone he sounded. And across the room, in the stillness he'd tried to shatter, the truth echoed louder than any outburst ever could. He wasn't defending Kentucky. He was defending himself. From her, from the record, and from what he had chosen to leave out. With the truth cornering him and no facts left to stand on, Daniel Cameron did what power so often does when exposed. It didn't answer the charge. It attacked the voice speaking it. His expression tightened, the cool professionalism from earlier replaced by something far more familiar. Resentment. Not at what had been revealed, but at who had revealed it. He leaned into the microphone, not to clarify, not to defend, but to wound. Let's stop pretending this hearing is about justice, he said, his voice calm but laced with derision. It's a show, and frankly, I won't sit here and play a role in Madam Microphone's latest act. The words dropped like acid into the silence. A ripple moved through the chamber, not of agreement, but of recognition. He had gone personal, deliberately. The phrase wasn't new. It had first surfaced a year earlier, born from conservative cable shows and Twitter threads that took Jasmine Crockett's sharp, unfiltered presence in a congressional hearing and turned it into a caricature. Madam Microphone, a term soaked in sexism and dog whistle disdain, was their way of saying too loud, too emotional, too much. To label her as noise rather than intellect, performance instead of substance, a black woman who dared to take up space, silenced not with arguments, but with mockery. And now Cameron resurrected that nickname in the middle of a federal hearing, on record, under oath, not because it was true, but because it was easy, because the evidence had turned against him, because the questions had no safe answers. And so, he reached not for the law, but for a punchline. But the room didn't laugh, the press didn't type, the staffers didn't blink. Instead, the chamber held still in that cold, electric way it does when someone just showed the whole country who they really are. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't speak. But the heat in her silence said more than any rebuttal ever could. Because everyone had just seen it, not the exposure of a witness, but the collapse of a mask. Daniel Cameron wasn't refuting her. He was retaliating. And in doing so, he proved the very point he tried to dismiss. Cameron had hoped to dismiss her with a nickname, but in that moment, he didn't realize what Jasmine Crockett had brought wasn't just a voice, it was a receipt, and not metaphorical, literal. She didn't fire back with words. She didn't need to. Instead, Jasmine Crockett reached calmly into a thin, matte black folder. Her movement was quiet, almost surgical. The kind that doesn't announce an attack, only its precision. What emerged wasn't rhetoric. It was a document, one page, printed, highlighted, stamped. She held it aloft without flair. No grand gestures, just a steady hand and a voice sharp enough to slice through spin. This, she said, is a verified internal email from the Kentucky Law and Order Fund, a political action committee that supported your campaign. A murmur passed through the room. Jasmine didn't pause. It was sent exactly 21 days before your office announced no homicide charges in the death of Breonna Taylor. She read directly from the page, her voice unhurried but deliberate. Contribution needs to be expedited to ensure Cameron maintains communication stability in light of Breonna decision. Subject line, let's not anger the FOP before November. The phrase landed like a brick dropped on glass. Everyone in the room felt it. That sudden shift from political theory to naked transaction. The veneer cracked. She lowered the page slightly, allowing everyone a full view of it. The camera zoomed in. One law clerk near the back audibly whispered, "That's game over." Jasmine continued, her eyes never leaving Cameron now. "So I ask you, Mr. Cameron, was it prosecutorial discretion that led you to withhold homicide charges from the grand jury?" Her tone was razor thin but steady, like a scalpel in a surgeon's grip. "Or was it this?" She lifted the email slightly higher. "A warning, a reminder, a payoff in plain text, warning you not to anger the Fraternal Order of Police before your next election." Cameron said nothing, but the color in his face changed. Not red with rage, but gray with calculation. His fingers curled on the table. Jasmine stepped forward, laying the page gently on the witness table in front of him. Not tossed, not thrown, placed like evidence. "You say you were bound by law, but this shows you were bound by politics. You say your hands were tied, but this shows they were held." The tension in the chamber now was suffocating. No one typed, no one shuffled. The quiet wasn't deference. It was pressure, building, inch by inch. She turned to the committee, slowly, as if bringing them into the weight of the moment. "We cannot allow silence to dress itself as legal integrity. Not when the paper trail leads straight through a dead girl's name to a campaign ledger." Then she looked back to Cameron, this time not as a congresswoman confronting a witness, but as a citizen speaking to power. "So I'll ask again, directly, and on the record." She paused, not to perform, but to give him nowhere to run. "Is this email, this money, this deadline, the reason Breonna Taylor never had her day in court?" The silence that followed wasn't absence. It was presence. The presence of something too real to dodge, too detailed to deny, too late to erase. And for the first time in that hearing, Daniel Cameron looked like a man no longer answering questions, but hearing them in his sleep. The receipts had landed, the evidence had spoken, and yet it wasn't enough. Because no matter how damning the paper trail was, there was still a voice missing from the table. A voice that had been ignored from the very beginning, until now. A quiet knock from the side door broke the tension. Jasmine Crockett gave a subtle nod. The clerk stepped aside, and from the hallway entered a woman whose name was written into the very foundation of that room's existence. Tamika Palmer, mother of Breonna Taylor, walked slowly, with the careful steps of someone who had carried too much grief for too long. She wasn't accompanied by lawyers, aides, or cameras. She didn't need them. Her presence alone recentered the room. A chair had been left for her beside the primary witness table. She lowered herself into it, one hand gripping the edge as if the furniture might dissolve beneath her. In her lap, a folded piece of paper. In her other hand, a photograph. Brianna, 26, beaming in hospital scrubs. When she reached for the microphone, her hand shook, but only slightly. The chamber, once bustling with subtext, stilled. Not out of decorum, out of gravity. "My name is Tamika Palmer," she began, her voice raw, dry, barely more than a whisper. "And I wasn't supposed to be here." No one moved. Every pair of eyes fixed on her. "I was supposed to be picking out centerpieces for my daughter's wedding. I was supposed to be helping her decorate a nursery when she was ready for kids. I was supposed to be a mother, not a mourner." She stopped, looking down at her own hands as if surprised they were still functioning. "But instead," she said, "I became a hashtag. I became a press conference. I became the mother of a girl whose name people chant, but whose case no one finished." Her eyes, now wet, rose and locked on the man, seated feet away. "Mr. Cameron," she said, steady now, "I believed you." She paused, and the word believed hung in the air like a cracked foundation. "When you spoke at your first press conference, I thought, maybe he'll do the right thing. Maybe finally someone won't be afraid to say what we all already know, that what happened to Brianna was wrong." A deep breath, then a tremor in her voice. "But I didn't get a call from your office. I didn't get a visit. You didn't send anyone. I found out that no one would be charged with killing my daughter from the news." The room exhaled all at once. Soft gas, shifting chairs, a tear wiped behind trembling glasses. "I sat in my living room and watched you tell the country the grand jury had done its job," she said. "I watched it just like everyone else, except I wasn't everyone else. I was her mother, and you didn't think I needed to know first." Her hands clenched the photograph tighter now. Her shoulders hunched forward, not weak, but bracing. "Do you know what that feels like?" she asked. "To learn your daughter's case is closed from a TV anchor before you've even been told by the people who made the decision?" Her voice cracked, but she kept going. Not for drama, because this was her only chance to speak in a room that had once shut her out. "It wasn't a justice process. It was a political strategy, one that you ran with your back turned to me, with your eyes on polls instead of on my child." Cameron sat frozen, not blinking, not writing, just enduring. "You didn't lose my trust because the law is complicated. You lost it because you didn't treat Brianna like a person. You treated her like a headline, like a liability." Now her anger came, not as a shout, but as quiet precision. "You didn't invite me to that grand jury room. You didn't even invite truth." She reached into her pocket and unfolded a handwritten note, creased and worn. "This is the speech I thought I'd give one day at her graduation from nursing school," she said. "It's not long, but I never got to read it, because bullets made her silence permanent before I ever got the chance." She didn't read it. She just held it up, then placed it on the table next to the photograph. "You were supposed to speak for her when she no longer could," she said. "But instead, you spoke for the system. You spoke for yourself." Her gaze softened, not out of forgiveness, but exhaustion. "I came here today not because I wanted to, but because you left me no choice." She looked across the panel now, to the lawmakers, to the press, to America. "If we're not brave enough to say what happened to Brianna was wrong, then we are not worthy of the jobs we hold. Not as lawmakers, not as prosecutors, not as people." She placed the microphone down with both hands. No one spoke. Not Jasmine, not Cameron, not even the clerk. It was the kind of silence that didn't need gavel or protocol. It didn't ask for response. It was the response. In that moment, there were no debates, no motions, no politics. There was only a mother, and the truth that had waited 3 years to be heard. The weight of a mother's truth doesn't fade when the microphone's cut. It reverberates, and by the time Tamika Palmer stepped out of room 2141, the echo of her words had already become aftershocks across an entire country. Before the hearing had even formally adjourned, the headlines had gone live. MSNBC's red ticker scrolled first. Daniel Cameron under fire for misleading grand jury in Breonna Taylor case. By the time Jasmine Crockett walked down the Capitol steps, CNN had pinned its top story. Congressional bombshell raises legal questions about former Kentucky AG. But what caught the most attention was Fox News, breaking from its usual tone, publishing the stark headline, "New Evidence Sparks Bipartisan Outrage Over Breonna Taylor Investigation." Across media, it wasn't just a report, it was a rupture. For the first time since the case had gone cold in public memory, it had re-entered the national bloodstream with undeniable force. And this time, it wasn't activists shouting into empty air. It was sworn testimony, internal memos, digital receipts, and the mother of a dead nurse who had just told the entire country that she found out her daughter's killers would walk free by watching TV. Social media erupted. Twitter, now rebranded as X, lit up with overlapping storm fronts of rage, grief, and reckoning. The hashtags trended by the hour. Cameron lied, grand jury gagged, she deserved justice, Madam Microphone was right. Clips of Jasmine Crockett holding up the leaked PAC email flooded Instagram reels. On TikTok, users layered her, quote, "Was it the law or was it November?" over protest footage, funeral images, and courtroom graphics. The real shift, though, came from inside the government. That same evening, 5 Democratic members of the House Judiciary Committee held an impromptu press conference on the Capitol steps. But they weren't alone. Standing to the side, not holding signs but signing the resolution itself, were 2 Republican lawmakers, James Calvert of Ohio and Monica Dillard of Colorado. Both centrists with law backgrounds, both visibly rattled by the day's hearing. "This is not about party," Calvert said. "This is about power being used to avoid truth. And if what we saw today holds under further scrutiny, then we are talking about obstruction dressed in official language." The statement drew immediate interest. Journalists pressed for confirmation. Would the committee recommend a referral to the Department of Justice? They didn't answer. Because just then, a bombshell arrived. Not on live TV, but in the inbox of a senior ProPublica reporter. A typed, unsigned 2-page letter. The return address, Frankfort, Kentucky. The source identified themselves only as a former high-level staffer in the Office of the Attorney General of Kentucky. The document was clean, direct, without emotion, but devastating in its content. "We knew Breonna Taylor would never receive a homicide charge referral. This was not due to a lack of evidence, but a lack of will." From early planning meetings, staff was told the goal was to conclude decisively, without escalation. The phrase "manage political optics" appeared in multiple internal drafts of our communication strategy. One paragraph was underlined. "We were not told to seek justice. We were told to avoid consequences." By morning, the anonymous whistleblower letter had been verified by at least 2 sources familiar with internal deliberations. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic all ran simultaneous updates. Editorial pages filled with blunt questions. Did Daniel Cameron bend the justice system to shield a police narrative? Was the grand jury used not to deliberate, but to distract? More damning still, the Louisville Courier-Journal, Cameron's hometown paper, ran the following headline across its front page. "Breonna's justice was managed, not denied. Staffer says that was the point." And then came the voices from within. Senator Grace Hensley of Pennsylvania called for a Senate Oversight Subcommittee to immediately open a parallel inquiry. Congressman Elijah Burnett, DGA, filed a motion for the House Ethics Committee to issue a subpoena for all PAC-related communications between Cameron's office and outside law enforcement organizations. Even Senator Martin Voss, our Illinois, a known law and order conservative, acknowledged in a Sunday appearance on Meet the Press, "If political funds were influencing prosecutorial boundaries in a murder investigation, then we need to be clear. That is not law enforcement. That is legalized betrayal." Outside government, legal organizations responded just as fast. The American Bar Association quietly released a statement of concern referencing Rule 3.8 of the ABA's Model Rules for Prosecutors. The decision to withhold charges that align with probable cause, particularly under political pressure, may constitute a violation of prosecutorial ethics and warrant disbarment. Meanwhile, civil rights groups went further. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund announced it was filing a motion to open an independent review of all prosecutorial decisions made under Cameron's tenure, starting with Breonna Taylor's case. But the most emotionally searing response came not from lawmakers or lawyers, but from Louisville itself. A candlelight vigil that began with 30 people outside the Jefferson County Courthouse turned into 5,000 by nightfall. Hundreds held signs that no longer asked for justice. They accused the system of having stolen it. Some held posters quoting Jasmine Crockett's line, "You didn't fail to serve justice. You denied this country even the chance to ask for it." Others carried photos of Tamika Palmer holding her daughter's picture. No slogans, just the image, just the truth. Back in Washington, the ripple effect grew. Talk of legislation resurfaced, dormant since 2020, now under the informal title, the Breonna Bill. Spearheaded by Crockett and co-sponsored by members of the Black Caucus, it sought to ban no-knock warrants nationwide, require full disclosure of all PAC contributions to elected prosecutors, and mandate federal review of any homicide cases closed without trial when new evidence emerges. Cable news called it a reckoning in real time. But inside Daniel Cameron's circle, it was a collapse. By day 5, 2 former deputies had resigned from his re-election committee. By day 6, the Kentucky Bar Association opened a preliminary investigation into professional misconduct. By day 7, Daniel Cameron, once considered a rising star, once floated as a possible Supreme Court contender, was described by The Hill as the first attorney general taken down by a mother, a microphone, and a paper trail. And Jasmine, she said almost nothing, declined every interview, issued no statement, until the following Monday, when a reporter caught her exiting the Capitol and asked, "How does it feel to bring this all to light?" She didn't slow down, but as she walked, she said, "It's not light, it's truth." And truth was always there. They just thought no one would drag it into daylight. And then she disappeared through the doors. No fanfare, no triumph, just justice, slowly, finally, catching up to power. The headlines had scorched through every corridor of power, and the smoke hadn't even cleared when the Justice Department stepped forward. Not with words of sympathy, but with subpoenas. On a cold Monday morning, just 8 days after the congressional hearing that upended a nation's conscience, the Department of Justice released a blunt, 6-line press statement. It wasn't dressed in political niceties or buried in legal jargon. The top line read simply, "The United States Department of Justice is formally reopening its investigation into the death of Breonna Taylor and the prosecutorial conduct surrounding the case." Cable news broke into coverage mid-segment. Phones buzzed in courtrooms. In Kentucky, Daniel Cameron was notified before the press even saw the announcement. A sealed federal summons was delivered to his legal team at 7:42 a.m. By noon, the official DOJ letter, stamped, signed, and marked urgent review, was public record. It cited potential violations of both the Civil Rights Act and federal prosecutorial ethics guidelines, explicitly naming withheld charging options, coordinated external influence, and grand jury obstruction by omission. In legal circles, the message was deafening. This wasn't just about what Daniel Cameron didn't do. It was about what he might have prevented others from doing. Reporters camped outside Cameron's home. Aerial footage showed his SUV leaving just after dawn, headed for an undisclosed legal office. No statement, no denial, only silence, and the hum of a defense team now fully activated. And then came the call no public figure wants to receive twice in a lifetime. Daniel Cameron was being summoned back to Congress. A second hearing, this time not as a subject of inquiry, but as the central witness in a bipartisan investigation tied to an active federal probe. He would appear before the Special Judiciary Oversight Subcommittee on Prosecutorial Misconduct, a body convened only 3 times in the past 2 decades, each involving high-profile government figures and suspected abuse of office. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m., room 1100 of the Hart Senate building. Live broadcast, public, no redactions, and no prepared statements without approval. The chairwoman of the subcommittee? None other than Jasmine Crockett. When asked for comment, she offered only this. This time, the room won't go quiet because no one is speaking. It will go quiet because the truth will. As the date approached, the pressure mounted. Leaked internal memos showed the DOJ had subpoenaed every PAC communication sent to or from Cameron's office during the 5 months leading to the Breonna Taylor grand jury decision. Investigators had also requested server data logs, Slack archives, and encrypted messaging backups used by campaign advisors. Federal agents were reportedly re-interviewing former staffers, including the anonymous whistleblower who had revealed that optics, not justice, guided our process. By the Friday before his second appearance, public opinion had turned. According to a Gallup emergency poll, 67% of Americans believed Daniel Cameron had acted with political motivation rather than legal integrity. Among independent voters, the number soared past 75%. Louisville prepared for protests. Fences were erected around the courthouse. Yet no one threatened violence. No one called for revenge. Only one chant echoed at rallies across multiple states. Ask him under oath. The morning of the second hearing arrived under an overcast sky. The Capitol grounds buzzed with media. This wasn't just a political event. It was a reckoning now written into the machinery of federal oversight. As Daniel Cameron stepped out of the black sedan and into the long marble hallway of the Hart Building, the silence was suffocating. The same cameras that once followed him as a rising GOP star now panned slowly across his face, not for angles but for tremors. Inside, room 1100 had been packed since sunrise, not with activists or celebrities, but with lawyers, historians, ethics professors, retired judges, and the parents of victims who saw in Breonna's story a reflection of every system that had once passed them over. At exactly 9 a.m., the gavel came down. Jasmine Crockett opened the hearing with a single sentence. Let the record show that this proceeding does not begin with suspicion. It begins with the evidence already made public. Cameron sat, flanked by counsel, a stack of folders in front of him. But this time, he wasn't reading. He was listening. The first question came swift and direct. Mr. Cameron, on what legal basis did you omit homicide charges from the prosecutorial instructions given to the grand jury in the case of Breonna Taylor? He opened his mouth, but no answer came. Another question followed. Were you aware of any coordination between your office and political action committees in the weeks preceding your charging decision? Still nothing. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. We are not here to speculate about your intentions, she said. We are here to document your choices. And every moment you withhold clarity is another moment this country is reminded that justice in the wrong hands becomes a strategy, not a principle. The tension in the room was tangible. Every breath felt counted. Every silence now a statement of its own. Cameron finally leaned forward. I made the decision that I believed was right, based on the law. But Crockett cut in, not with anger, but with surgical calm. And did the law also instruct you to meet with the Fraternal Order of Police the same week their affiliated PAC sent your office funding recommendations labeled urgent? No response. Did the law advise you to notify the media before notifying Breonna Taylor's mother? Still nothing. Did the law tell you to exclude a murder charge from consideration while simultaneously drafting a press release that referred to the case as tragic but uncriminal? His lawyer leaned in, whispered. Cameron nodded but didn't speak, and so Crockett closed the folder. Then let the silence reflect the record. Outside, reporters spoke in hushed tones, not because they had nothing to say, but because, for once, the system was speaking for itself. And this time, it wasn't letting him walk out clean. Inside the hearing room, silence had sealed a man's fate. But outside in city squares and on courthouse steps, the silence was over. And a movement, long simmering, erupted with a single defiant cry. We stand with Madam Microphone. It began as a whisper, a message typed in black font against a red background, shared by a grassroots group in Detroit. We believe black women. We stand with Jasmine Crockett. Madam Microphone. Within 24 hours, it had become a rallying call across the country. Civil rights organizations, student groups, faith leaders, and survivors' coalitions flooded social media with a single unified image. A silhouette of Jasmine Crockett standing at a podium, her fists not raised in defiance but calmly gripping a microphone, weaponized not by volume, but by truth. By the end of the week, more than 120 coordinated marches and vigils had been planned. Cities like Atlanta, Oakland, Minneapolis, Newark, and Memphis declared local observance days. In Louisville, where Breonna Taylor's story began, an estimated 22,000 people gathered outside Jefferson Square Park, many holding candles in one hand and printouts of the leaked PAC email in the other. The signs said everything. Truth isn't loud. You just chose not to listen. Silenced women are still dangerous. She spoke for all of us. We stand with Madam Microphone. But these weren't just protests, they were declarations. In Birmingham, an 83-year-old civil rights veteran who once marched with Dr. King led a crowd through Kelly Ingram Park. "I haven't seen this kind of clarity since Selma," he said into a bullhorn. "They thought they could bury her under a nickname, but they didn't bury her. They crowned her." In New York, more than 10,000 people marched across the Brooklyn Bridge. At the center was a towering banner carried by black nurses and EMTs, many wearing photos of Breonna Taylor stitched into their scrubs. The banner read, "Your job should not be a death sentence. Your voice should not be a target." In Houston, high school students walked out of class at noon, forming a human microphone shape on their football field. Drones captured the image, which was broadcast across national television. Meanwhile, major organizations responded not with statements, but action. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Color of Change, ACLU, and Black Lives Matter Global Network held a joint press conference on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where they announced the formation of a new federal campaign, the Microphone Project, a multi-state voter mobilization and judicial reform coalition inspired by Jasmine's testimony and the movement that followed. "We're not here to praise a soundbite," said Sherilyn Eiffel, senior counsel with the NAACP. "We're here because a system tried to erase her by turning her voice into a punchline. But that voice spoke calmly and completely, and it cracked the shield of institutional deceit. And the energy wasn't limited to the streets. It lit up the screens. The phrase, Madam Microphone, once born in derision, now trended at #1 on X and TikTok for 6 consecutive days, not as mockery, but as a mantle. Art students across the country created digital tributes. One popular piece, a graphic of Jasmine's silhouette overlaid with courtroom documents in flames, was reposted over 1.2 million times. Independent musicians sampled her congressional quotes into protest songs, podcasts, poetry slams, spoken word events. All recentered Jasmine's voice not as an anomaly, but as a blueprint. Back in Washington, congressional aides reported an explosion of phone calls. Constituents flooded their representatives with demands. Investigate Daniel Cameron. Pass the Breonna bill. Expand protections for whistleblowers and prosecutors under PAC pressure. And outside Capitol buildings in more than 30 states, the same chant echoed. "We stand with Madam Microphone. We speak with her now." Even media outlets, some of which had once minimized or mocked Crockett, pivoted. On CNN's State of the Union, a former federal judge declared, "She didn't grandstand, she grand uncovered." On MSNBC, Joy Reid called her the most unbought woman in Washington. Even the Wall Street Journal ran a rare op-ed acknowledging that Crockett's restraint under fire was not volume. It was volume measured in consequence. But perhaps most striking was a clip aired by PBS NewsHour, a quiet, devastating segment featuring 4 black mothers from 4 different states, all seated in a church basement. They weren't political experts. They weren't activists. They were grieving women who had lost children to law enforcement, who now saw in Jasmine something they hadn't seen before. "She didn't just speak truth," one said. "She didn't flinch when they called her names. She didn't yell back. She just stood there and told the story they've been trying to hide since slavery. That when a black woman speaks, they label it chaos so they don't have to hear the clarity." And that was the power now spilling across the nation. Not just that Jasmine Crockett had fought back, but that she had done so without becoming the thing they accused her of being. Loud, uncontrolled, unreasonable. She had been factual, surgical, unshakable, and the country had seen it. From college campuses to courtroom hallways, the slogan spread, not just as protest art, but as policy demand. Youth organizers launched campaigns encouraging voters to call their legislators, flood committee hearings, and sign petitions to expand oversight of state prosecutors. All under one headline: we're not turning down the volume. We're making sure it finally counts. In a surprise move, the National Council of Black Churches dedicated its upcoming convention to the faith of justice, with Crockett slated as the opening keynote speaker. And at Spelman College, students began painting a mural, 20 feet high, of Jasmine holding a microphone over courtroom transcripts, with a quote from her first hearing scrawled beneath it. Silence is what power asks for when it's cornered by the truth. But it wasn't hero worship. It wasn't branding. It was personal. People marched because they'd heard that silence before, in phone calls never returned, in police reports never finished, in courtrooms where names like Breonna were spoken only as logistics, not as daughters. And now, for the first time, someone had carried that silence into the halls of power and spoken over it, not with noise, but with proof. In Los Angeles, one woman summed it up best as she raised her sign to the sky. She took their nickname and made it a warning. So now, when you call her Madam Microphone, you'd better be ready for what comes through the speakers. As the chants faded from the streets and the microphones were lowered, the nation turned to one woman, hoping for a quote, a victory lap, a photo op. But Jasmine Crockett didn't show up for applause. She disappeared, into silence, into work, and into the one thing that still hadn't been delivered, the law. For days, networks had tried to book her. Primetime anchors left voicemails. Magazine covers drafted mock-ups with her silhouette in bold overlays. The woman who broke the wall. Congress's quiet hammer. The prosecutor they didn't see coming. But Jasmine declined them all. When CNN's senior political editor asked for an exclusive, she responded with a one-line email. This isn't about legacy. It's about correction. When the New Yorker sent a long-form writer to shadow her, her assistant met them at the door and handed over a copy of the Breonna Taylor police report instead. It was annotated, red pen circling errors, omissions, timelines that never matched. She didn't need her name in print. She needed every sentence to finally speak the truth. For the first time in years, a public official was being called a symbol and rejecting it. Reporters begged her for 10 minutes of camera time. Producers called her staff, offering jet travel, wardrobe, hotel buyouts. Her answer never changed. I didn't come to be a symbol. I came so that names like Breonna Taylor would no longer vanish into spreadsheets and silence. That was the only sentence she offered, once outside a committee chamber, when a group of journalists ambushed her with praise. She said it calmly, without anger or flair. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the same elevator she used before anyone knew her name. But while the cameras were watching elsewhere, she wasn't idle. Behind a locked office door in the Rayburn building, Jasmine Crockett went back to the beginning. Not of her own journey, but of Breonna's. She reread the original warrants, the 911 call, the medical reports, the grand jury transcript with entire sections blacked out. She didn't cry. She outlined, didn't post on social media. She drafted, didn't take a victory lap. She took red ink to a federal statute on prosecutorial immunity, and for every unanswered phone call from a morning show host, there was a returned call from a policy advisor. For every red carpet she declined, she walked into a closed-door meeting with legislative counsel. Because this wasn't a moment for posture. This was the window, the narrow one, the one that always slams shut after the press moves on. She wasn't about to let it close. For 2 weeks, her office lights stayed on until 2 a.m. Most nights she didn't go home. She ordered takeout and slept on the couch. The cleaning staff got used to her presence, tiptoeing around with vacuums as she cross-referenced DOJ findings with state-level criminal procedure loopholes. When her aide asked if she needed rest, she responded without looking up. Rest didn't save Breonna. Reform will. And so she built it, line by line. Not from politics, but from absence. The absence of accountability, the absence of transparency, the absence of urgency in every government official who had once called Breonna Taylor's death a tragedy and done nothing else. The bill she drafted wasn't long. It was sharp, surgical. and it was named exactly as it should have been, the Breonna Taylor Federal Accountability Act. It included mandatory full disclosure of all PAC communications with prosecutors and AGs, federal review authority over state-level grand jury proceedings involving use of force deaths, an automatic Department of Justice audit if a homicide charge is omitted in cases involving law enforcement, a whistleblower protection clause for prosecutors, clerks, or AG staff who report political interference. She didn't rush to announce it. She didn't hold a press conference. Instead, she walked it to the House clerk herself. No cameras, no press, just her and a leather folder. The woman behind the desk looked up, blinking. "Is this the bill everyone's been whispering about?" Jasmine nodded. "It's the one they hoped I wouldn't finish." And then she turned and left. Outside, the world kept spinning. Awards began arriving at her office. Journalism coalitions, civil rights foundations, legal ethics boards. One even included a golden microphone trophy with the words "Madam Microphone" engraved at the base. She sent it back with a handwritten note. "Turn it into a scholarship fund. Name it after Breonna," because Jasmine Crockett didn't need to be the story. She needed the story to end differently next time. Not with a mother learning through a TV screen. Not with police reports doctored to fit press narratives. Not with a grand jury asking, "Why weren't we told we could indict for murder?" In the quiet that followed the hearings, she rebuilt a louder form of justice. One that didn't shout, one that didn't need a stage, one that fit in the black text of a bill, waiting to become law. And for the first time since Breonna Taylor's name became a symbol, the system she left behind began to look just a little less familiar, a little less untouchable, a little less rigged, because someone finally stopped fighting to be heard and started writing down what could never be silenced again. With the bill filed and the truth no longer trapped behind closed doors, Jasmine Crockett didn't hold a press conference. She didn't walk a red carpet. She returned instead to the place where silence had once ruled, where justice had once been buried in indifference, the Capitol steps. But this time, she wasn't walking alone. It was just past 7 a.m. when the first figure appeared at the base of the Capitol. The marble still held the chill of night. Washington was quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something it could neither schedule nor spin. No security barriers, no crowds, just the sound of footsteps on stone and the weight of a portrait wrapped in linen. It took 4 people to carry it, 2 older women, 1 man in scrubs, and a teenage boy with a Breonna Taylor pin on his jacket. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. Every movement was choreographed not in practice but in reverence. They unwrapped the cloth slowly, corners first until the full image came into view. Breonna, 26, calm, radiant, wearing blue. Her eyes gazed slightly upward, as if still waiting for the world to meet her there. Beneath the image, freshly inscribed in gold acrylic letters on deep black. She didn't get to live to tell the story, but someone told it for her. The words glowed faintly in the early light. Not like neon, but like memory. Alive, impossible to ignore. Someone knelt and positioned the base onto the 7th step of the Capitol's east staircase. That was the step her mother had once stood on, clutching the original lawsuit in trembling hands, flanked by no allies, drowned in noise. This time, the step was quiet, and this time, it would not be empty. Jasmine Crockett approached from the left, alone, her coat buttoned to the neck. No entourage, no aides, no notes. She didn't carry a microphone, just a folded sheet of paper in one pocket, the draft copy of the Breonna Taylor Accountability Act, and a handkerchief in the other. She didn't stand at the top of the stairs. She didn't place herself above the portrait. She stood just to the side of it, shoulder aligned, as if to say, "I'm not here to explain her story. I'm just here to make sure it was finally heard." A few more people arrived, quietly, a retired postal worker, a former prosecutor, a mother and daughter holding hands. Someone brought a candle and placed it at the foot of the frame. Someone else dropped a nursing school graduation pin in the corner. There were no speeches, no chants. Just people arriving one by one, like pieces returning to a puzzle that had been scattered too long. And then, through the gentle crowd, a girl emerged. She couldn't have been more than 15. Slim, dark-skinned, wearing a simple sweatshirt that read, "Madam Microphone taught me to speak." She didn't hesitate. She stepped toward the frame, then toward Jasmine. The two stood in silence for a long moment, the kind of stillness that felt like it stretched beyond time, across generations, across all the lives whose names we never heard. Then the girl spoke, barely above a whisper, but the words cut through the morning air like a vow. "You didn't just hold the mic. You turned it into justice." Jasmine blinked once, slow. Her throat tightened, not out of pride, but out of grief that had never quite left her. Grief that didn't belong to her, but had passed through her, sharpened into something the system could finally feel. She looked down at the girl, not with awe, not with superiority, but with something closer to recognition. "It's yours now," Jasmine said. "The mic, the moment, the fight, it belongs to you." The girl nodded, and for a brief second, her fingers touched Jasmine's. Not a handshake, not a thank you, just contact. Real, grounded. A photographer nearby didn't lift their camera. They just watched, knowing some things weren't meant to be captured, only remembered. As the crowd grew, 50, then 100, then more, no one shouted. No one led. They simply stood together, shoulder to shoulder, not in anger, in alignment. Behind them, a choir of Howard University students began to hum softly. No lyrics, just harmony. It was "A Change Is Gonna Come," but slower, more sorrowful, as if time itself were apologizing for being late. Jasmine remained on the step, beside Brianna's portrait, eyes fixed forward, not on the cameras beginning to gather at the edges, but on the horizon. The mall stretched out before her, like a long breath the country had held in for years. She exhaled, just once. The wind picked up slightly, brushing the edge of the portrait. For a second, the gold text shimmered again. She didn't get to live to tell the story, but someone told it for her. That someone was now standing next to the next someone. And from somewhere behind the crowd, a woman's voice rang clear, not loud but resonant. "Let this step become a page. Let this portrait become a law. Let her name be followed by none." No one clapped. They didn't need to, because in that moment, something changed. Not in the bill, or the headlines, or the political calculus, but in the very space between power and people. It shrank, it breathed, and it finally listened. And Jasmine, who had once been called too loud, too angry, too much, said nothing, because the microphone had already done its job, and now it was standing in someone else's hands. As the portrait stood tall on the Capitol steps and the crowd began to thin beneath a rising sun, one truth remained, louder than applause, deeper than reform, and far more dangerous than silence. Justice in the hands of the right person doesn't just punish wrongdoing, it teaches the country how to feel again. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Breonna Taylor is not just about a courtroom or a headline. It's about the slow, grueling fight to make truth matter in a system built to forget. It's about how silence is not always absence. Sometimes it's engineered. And it's about what happens when someone dares to speak not louder, but longer than the system ever expected. Jasmine didn't just survive the insults, the threats, the smears. She metabolized them, turned every attack into fuel, every smear into steel. And every time someone told her she was too much, too loud, too black, too angry, she chose to stay in the room. That's what justice really looks like. Not the gavel, not the press release, but the choice to stay standing when the room wants you gone. What this story teaches us, what it burns into the national consciousness, is that power is not destroyed by rage alone. It is undone by endurance. Jasmine didn't outscream her opponents. She outlasted them. She showed up when it wasn't safe. She stayed seated when it wasn't easy. And when the moment came, she didn't erupt. She unfolded evidence, one sheet at a time, until no one could look away. The system had depended on her breaking, and she didn't. Because when your voice is tied to the dead, your silence is no longer an option. She carried Breonna not in her slogans, but in her spine. And there is a deeper lesson here, one that lives beyond the hearing room and marches. That when power is used to protect itself, truth becomes a threat. And when someone dares to speak that truth, calmly, surgically, they are called dangerous. That's the irony. Jasmine Crockett was never dangerous because she yelled. She was dangerous because she knew, because she read every line, because she refused to let a mother learn the fate of her daughter from a headline ever again. And for that, they tried to make her a punchline. What they didn't realize was you can't mock someone who's carrying the truth. You can only delay the moment when it breaks through. So what do we take from all this? That justice is not a destination. It's a decision, every day, to ask harder questions, to stay in uncomfortable rooms, to hold your ground even when you're the only voice not cracking. Jasmine Crockett didn't win because the system allowed her to. She won because she understood the system and then used its own rules against its silence. She showed us that the most revolutionary act in a broken democracy isn't chaos, it's clarity. And perhaps most important of all, this wasn't about making her a hero. Jasmine never wanted that. She didn't ask for statues or magazine covers. Her only request was this, that the next time a black woman is silenced in a courtroom or a mother buries her child and gets no answers, someone stays. Stays to ask, stays to listen, stays to document the betrayal until the country can no longer pretend it doesn't see it. Because if there's any final lesson from all of this, it's that truth doesn't die with the victims. It waits quietly for someone brave enough to carry it back into the light. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.